Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Recently, the Supreme Court of the United States has made some incredibly influential and consequential decisions. But what is the Supreme Court? What is its role in US politics? And why has the Supreme Court become so active? Let's talk about these questions and more on today's episode of Thinking in English. You can find the full transcript for free on the Thinking in English blog. Check out my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more great content. And leave a like, rating, review, or follow wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. To overturn. To overturn. To change a legal decision. For example, the Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade decision. Branch. Branch. A part of something larger. As in, the Supreme Court is part of the judicial branch of government. To enforce. To enforce. To make people obey a law. For instance, it isn't easy for the police to enforce speed limits. To implement. To implement. To put a plan, system, or law into operation. Such as Congress refused to implement tax reforms. To interpret. To interpret. To decide what the intended meaning of something is. For example, it is difficult to interpret the meaning of statistics. Check. Check. Rules intended to prevent one person or group from having too much power. For example, we need effective checks on the power of the president. Veto. Veto. An official power or right to refuse to accept or allow something. For example, in the US, the president has the power of veto over any bill. Segregation. Segregation. The policy of keeping one group of people apart from another and treating them differently, especially because of race, sex, or religion. For example, the system of racial segregation that used to exist in South Africa was called apartheid. To split. To split. To divide into two or more parts. For instance, the teacher split the students into 3 groups. The US Supreme Court made one of their most influential legal decisions a few weeks ago by removing American women's constitutional right to an abortion. Overnight, abortion became almost completely illegal in around half of American states. I already recorded an episode on abortion and the Supreme Court, focusing on the Roe v. Wade debate, which I recommend you all listen to. But it seems as though the Supreme Court is not finished making major decisions. It has even been suggested that a wide range of previous court cases could be overturned in the next few months or years, from gun control legislation to the right to contraception. Why has the US Supreme Court suddenly become so active? What are the powers or role of the Supreme Court? And what could the future hold for US laws and politics? Well, today I'm going to investigate and try to explain the history and role of the Supreme Court. In doing so, I will also introduce some of the most important vocabulary, terms, and phrases to help you understand American politics. Actually, many of these terms are not just relevant to American politics, but also your country's politics and governments around the world. Let's start with something basic. You've probably heard of the US government before. It's the people who make the decisions, laws, and policies that governs the most powerful country in the world, right? But it's not really accurate to think about the US government as one single group, one single organization. Instead, there are three separate parts or branches of the US government. The United States Constitution divides the power of the US government into three branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The verb to legislate means to make laws, and this is exactly the role of the legislative branch of government. In the US, the legislative branch of government is Congress, which consists of the House of Representatives and the Senate. All national laws in America are written and debated by the legislative branch. Congress also has the power to confirm or reject the president's choices for judges or other positions. And in theory, they are supposed to be the branch with the power to declare war, although this is no longer necessarily true. How is the legislative branch of government chosen? Well, every American citizen has the right to vote for the members of Congress, both senators and representatives. And the people they elect take up roles in this legislative branch. The executive branch of government has the responsibility to carry out, execute, and enforce laws decided by Congress. Over years, the power and role of the executive branch has increased significantly, and now it is generally considered to be the most influential branch of government. It is also the branch that you all will have heard of before. The executive branch includes the president, the vice president, cabinet, departments, agencies, and other organizations designed to implement laws. The president is the leader of America and currently is Democrat Joe Biden. The president has the official role of head of state, leader of the government, and commander in chief of the United States of armed forces. In a nutshell, the laws are first made by Congress and then given to the president to implement and enforce them. It is the president's job to make sure that the laws are actually used across the country. The president is supported by the vice president. If the president passes away, falls ill, or is unable to continue their role, then the vice president takes over. The vice president is also the deciding vote in the Senate. So if there is a 50-50 tie in voting on a law, the vice president has the right to make the decision. In addition to the president and vice president, there is also the cabinet. The cabinet includes senior officials who advise the president and work as officials or leaders of different departments. Now, America is so big and complicated that the president can't actually make every decision and implement every law by themselves. For this reason, there are hundreds of different agencies, departments, and committees who have the responsibility for certain laws and decisions. For example, the US Department of Education is responsible for education decisions. The US Department of State is responsible for international relations. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, enforces laws and investigates crimes. The third and often forgotten branch of the US government is the judicial branch. The judicial branch of government has the responsibility to evaluate laws. The courts of the US are all part of the judicial branch, with the Supreme Court being the most powerful, important, and influential organization. The judicial branch has the job of deciding or interpreting the meanings of laws, checking if laws violate the US Constitution, and then using these laws in individual cases. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the US, and they have the final decision over whether something is constitutional or not. Members of the Supreme Court are appointed by the President and are then approved by the Senate. And there are 9 members or justices of the court, and they serve until they die, retire, or are removed. Now, a common phrase that you will hear if you are interested in US politics is the separation of powers. And this is something common or talked about in other countries as well. And in fact, even in business sometimes. The separation of powers means that the legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch of government must be kept completely separate. Each branch of government has their own separate power, responsibilities, and in general is not allowed to use the powers of the other branches. For example, the president cannot make laws themselves, only implement them. Congress cannot decide if a law is constitutional, and the Supreme Court doesn't decide on how to implement a law. Moreover, an individual should not be a member of more than one branch at the same time. The purpose behind separation of powers is to ensure that one branch of government cannot become too powerful. It basically stops a president from being able to rule a country like a king or a dictator. The French political philosopher Montesquieu is often credited with giving the first and clearest explanation of the separation of powers. In 1748, he wrote, "When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty." Most countries have some form of separation of powers, but the UK is an example of a country without a strict separation of powers. In the UK, the three branches of government are much closer than in the US, and in the past, they were even closer. For example, the Prime Minister of the UK is the head of the executive. However, they are also a member of parliament and they are the leader of the majority party, meaning that they are also head of the legislature. Now, although the US has a strict separation of powers, this does not necessarily mean that the three branches cannot influence each other. The US has a system known as checks and balances. This is the ability to limit the power and change acts by the other branches. This is another way to stop one part from getting too powerful. For example, while the US president is in charge of the armed forces, Congress are in charge of declaring war and giving money to the armed forces and signing peace treaties. While the president is responsible for delivering laws, Congress decides how much money they have to use. While Congress can pass laws, the president can veto. So, in other words, say no. And while laws are made and implemented by Congress and the president, it is the Supreme Court who can decide if they are consistent with the Constitution. The role of the Supreme Court has changed a lot throughout the history of the USA. After a few decades of an undefined role, the power of judicial review, so the power to be able to check a law against the Constitution, was established in 1803 during a court case called Marbury versus Madison, one of the most important court cases in American history. Important not because of what the case was about, but because in this case, it was confirmed that the US Constitution was the most important thing in the USA, more important than any other law. And it was also confirmed that if there was an argument, a conflict between the Constitution and the law, the Supreme Court could decide. The role and power of the Supreme Court today dates from that decision 200 years ago. But it is also important to realize that the Supreme Court is a product of its time. Its role and influence depends a great deal on the cases it hears and the justices who are appointed. The court can only respond to the cases given to it, and its decisions therefore reflect the ideas, politics, and culture of the time. In the 19th century, the Supreme Court decided that the US Constitution was not designed to give rights to African Americans. That's right, the court decided that African Americans couldn't be US citizens. The infamous case is called Dred Scott versus Sandford, and it was heard by a Supreme Court with justices mainly from the slave owning South. So you can kind of guess why the court decided that African Americans shouldn't be US citizens. 50 years later, and after the Civil War, the Supreme Court gave another infamous decision that public services could be separate but equal. This meant that segregation was basically legal in the USA. And these decisions were a reflection of the ideas and beliefs of the time. From the 1950s until the 1970s, the court entered a period known as the Rights Revolution. They ended segregation, gave protection to minorities, including religious minorities like the Jehovah's Witnesses, extended protections for people who get arrested, like right to a lawyer, made abortion legal, ensured access to contraception, and ensured fair voting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the court reflects its members and the political culture, and it can only make decisions on the cases presented to it, meaning it cannot go and seek out a case. In US history, the Supreme Court has both protected minorities and taken away their rights. It has both encouraged social change and rejected it. And it has both expanded and reduced the role of the government. It really is dependent on who is in the court. Recently, the current court has made a number of important but controversial decisions. They overturned Roe v. Wade, effectively ending the national right to abortion, and this made worldwide news. And I have recorded an episode on it, so definitely check it out. However, they have also made it easier for people to carry guns and weapons. They changed the relationship between the church and the government so that religion can become even more powerful. And they have restricted the power of executive agencies, which basically means it is now impossible for America to have any kind of environmental policy. The Supreme Court has used its power to reshape American politics. And they are doing this in the opposite way to what Joe Biden wanted, to what the Democrat Party wanted. Now, how does this happen? Well, right now, the US has one of the most conservative courts in history. Out of 9 justices, 6 were appointed by Republican presidents, and 3 by Donald Trump. In essence, the court now has a conservative supermajority. For years, the court was split more evenly. It was about 4 liberal justices, 4 conservative justices, and a swing justice who was conservative generally, but would often vote with the liberal justices as well. However, with 6 conservatives, the court can now make decisions easily, make these powerful decisions easily. Furthermore, as the US is incredibly politically divided, and there's an increasing gap between liberals and conservatives, there are more and more important cases to be heard by the court. Across the USA, people are suing, taking different organizations to court over things that they don't agree with. And as Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, Donald Trump appointing 3 relatively young conservative justices will affect the Supreme Court for many years to come. Now, Joe Biden has recently appointed a new member of the court, replacing the retiring Liberal Justice Stephen Breyer with a new Liberal Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson. However, this will have little impact in changing the balance of the court. And after the summer break, the court will be making rulings on some other incredibly controversial cases. For example, they will decide whether states should have more power in elections, whether a business is allowed to discriminate against someone based on their sexuality, and whether race should be considered in university admissions. These decisions will also have major influence over US politics for years to come. It is also interesting to know that the US Supreme Court is incredibly unpopular right now, and so are many of their decisions. In May, a survey reported that the majority of Americans disapproved of the court. This is the first time in history that has ever happened. And in fact, the percentage of Americans who have confidence in the court is the lowest since 1973. So here is today's final thought. On this episode of Thinking in English, I have tried to examine, explain, and discuss the US Supreme Court and its role in the wider US government. In doing so, I have introduced a variety of important terms and vocabulary, like separation of powers, checks and balances, and branches of government. Moreover, many of these terms and ideas can be applied to other countries' legal and political systems. The US Supreme Court has long had a very influential role in some of the country's most important decisions, and right now it seems to be more active than ever. Over the next few months, it is really likely more politically significant decisions will also be made. How about in your countries? Is your country's Supreme Court powerful and influential in the same way as the US Supreme Court? What do you think of the US's recent decisions? Do you agree with what the court is doing, or do you disagree? Let me know. Let us all know in the comments on the blog. You can leave a comment on Spotify, or you can send me a message on Instagram. If you're over on Instagram, definitely follow me, Thinking in English Podcast. And I've started making a bit more content on Instagram. Maybe you'll all find it interesting. I hope you will. So you can go and follow me. Leave a like, a rating, a review on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you are listening right now. We're trying to become the most followed English learning podcast. I have quite a far way to go, but we can try. We can keep going. If you want to donate to me, you're more than welcome to. You can. There's a link in the description of the podcast and also on the Thinking in English blog. Actually, I'm uploading this on a Monday, so the day before, so Sunday, I uploaded a book review, but I didn't write the book review. One of you did. Paulo, a listener from Brazil, wrote a book review for a book he recently read, and I checked it for him and I put it on the blog. So if any of you would like to write book reviews for thinkinginenglish.blog, I'll obviously check and correct your English and send it back to you so you can know what mistakes you made. And then I'll put it on the blog and you will have something written in English on a slightly successful website. So, yeah, you're more than welcome to send me a message. You can email me or message me on Instagram or through the contact page on the blog. So, yeah, I think that's everything. I've talked a lot today. Thank you for listening. There's a lot of information in this episode. I hope you understand it, and have a good one.